Hello, my name is Emily, and thank you for joining us for the final instalment of Care Conversations. Before Jan, our chair of the Workhouse Network, introduces the session properly, I just want to go over some practicalities. We are recording this session to be later hosted on our website. However, your video and microphone are automatically turned off, so you will not be shown. Please use the chat function for any comments, and please change the recipients to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comments. Please use the Q&A button for any questions to our panelists. Both of these buttons can be found at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, on to Jan.
Oh, mistake number one. There we go. Thank you for coming along to these sessions. And this is the last of the three and focuses on mental health issues, both historic and in the contemporary setting. For those that don't know me, I am Jan Overfield-Shaw. As well as the chair of the Workhouse Network, I'm the Senior Partnership and Programme Manager at the NT, the Workhouse Southwell. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the project for those who may not know in the audience. The history of the workhouse system, and more importantly, the people who lived and worked there, have something to tell us about the centuries they inhabited, and that their lives and views and practices can also put the present in a critical light, hence contributing to its transformation. These care conversation events will, over this final day, approach the encounter between contemporary issues such as homelessness, learning disability and mental health, and the historiography of the workhouse, the poor law that legitimised the process, and poor law boards and guardians that maintained it. We will do this by exploring stories of people who are living through or experiencing poverty, health and disability, and recognising similar stories from the period of the workhouse, 1820s to 1948, and the emergence of the welfare state. We are not aiming to solve anything, or directly compare vagrants and the homeless, for example. We want to explore both to find commonality and genuine ways to work with contemporary issues surrounding poverty, disability, exclusion, and many other issues that come up through the historic record and contemporary experience. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Laura Drysdale from the Restoration Trust and Change Minds. So over to you, Laura.
Well, thank you, Jan. And it's great to be here. And I could say it's lovely to see you, but of course I can't see you. And also I'm a bit worried that you might not be able to see me because I'm drifting in and out of my backdrop. But I'm going to stick with it for now because what I've got behind me is a digital reconstruction of St Andrew's Hospital, or what was Norfolk Lunatic Asylum, Norfolk County Asylum, that was made by one of the members of Change Minds, which is the project that we run in partnership with Norfolk Record Office. So one of our participants created this lovely reconstructed image of what's now, and I guess this will be familiar to anybody who works with asylums or workhouses. Of course, it's now very expensive flats lived in by Norwich City footballers. So Jan asked me just to introduce myself. So I'm the director of the Restoration Trust, and we run projects which connect heritage and creativity experiences with people who live with mental health challenges. And we've got two sort of significant strands of interest, and one's archives and the other's historic landscapes and archaeology. And I always say that we've chosen those two areas mostly because they're free. because it's free usually to work in an archive, to use an archive, and it's free to walk in a historic landscape mostly. And we work a lot with people whose mental health issues arise from their social situation. So places which are free matter a lot. Change Minds is the project that has brought us here, and that's developed really in partnership between the Restoration Trust and the Norfolk Record Office. And I have this incredible good fortune, which is that I met this fantastic archivist, who's Gary Tewson, who's the county archivist at Norfolk. And they've got these astonishing records that, I guess this is often the case, they almost acquired them by chance. I mean, they were literally being thrown out. And as the sort of the remains of the asylum were being closed in the 1990s. And they were got to the Norfolk Record Office. And it came to pass that that I met Gary. I went to see the Record Office to see if they might be interested in doing something about oral history, because I thought that people who I was working with who had mental health issues might really enjoy and find it interesting to record oral histories about their experiences. And that was a sort of peak austerity. People were really being hammered. And so, you know, there was a loss of people's dignity in that process. And I felt partly that recapturing, getting some power over your own story would be a way to regain some dignity and have your voice heard in the world. But as soon as I managed to reach the Record Office and have this conversation, Gary immediately just said, I know what we can do. And he knew that they had these records from the Norfolk County Asylum. And we then began this process. And since that meeting, I think we've run 3 programs of the Change Minds. So where people meet for between 12 and 15 sessions to learn how to use the archive, explore the records, identify a person in the case books from the 1880s who they can research, and do something creative with that, and then finally have a sort of celebration. Am I going on too long, Jana? Would you like me to stop for a bit?
That's a fantastic introduction, and I suppose we have to, as well as Gary and yourself actually using the archive, wonder and want to thank the person who rescued them, who recognised they were really, really important documents and got them to the end. And I think that's still happening, isn't it, where we lose so much of ordinary people's experiences. And so a celebration. Thank you to that person from us today. So I'm going to now introduce Richard Johnson, who is part of Change Minds project, but is the coordinator and researcher of Dr. Hill's casebook. So over to you, Richard.
Good afternoon. I was asked to give a description of the benefits I've obtained from my research, but it would help to sort of give you a bit of background, personal background for myself. I think it'd be useful, as I hope it presents a clear comparison between my personal well-being before and after I commenced my research into the Norfolk County Lunatic Asylum. 3 years ago, I was experiencing another depressive episode, let's call it the 4th, during which I had self-harmed. On one occasion, it required surgical intervention. I had not been in paid employment for some time. I've been estranged from my parents 20 years, and I was almost completely socially isolated. At times, I'd been suicidal. At this point, my treating psychologist mentioned this project called Change Minds, which very fortunately was to start in a couple of months' time. I can still remember the initial rush of anticipatory elation of having this chance. Before the project kicked off, I was researching Victorian lunacy legislation. I should point out that my work experience is heavily law related, so it's my initial response wasn't quite as weird as it might seem. We are fortunate in Norfolk, thanks to the chap who found who did throw them in the skip, that we have such a huge volume and variety, more especially of asylum records, particularly from the time of Dr. Hills. They include the minutes of the Committee of Visitors, the asylum's equivalent of the Board of Guardians, wage books, account books, clerk's report book. But the jewels in the crown are the patient case books and the journals of Dr. William Hills, the medical superintendent of the asylum from 1861 to 1887. My first reading of his journal is like the metaphorical bolt of lightning. He wrote with good humour, and further digging revealed a man who of very real concern for his patients, hardworking and possessed of genuine humanity. John Connolly, the proponent of non-restraint in lunatic asylums and himself a medical superintendent, wrote in 1847, the medical superintendent will almost regard his patients as his children, and humanly speaking, his whole heart will be given to them. That's him, that's Dr. Hills. For his medical training at Guy's Hospital, his period at the Surrey Dispensary, and 33 years in pauper asylums, Dr. Hills devoted his life to the medical care of the poor, when other more prominent practitioners were quick to seek the money and fame of private practice. Dr. Hills was certainly not lacking in ability. After qualifying as a surgeon, an apothecary and a doctor of medicine, he was appointed medical superintendent at Norfolk in 1861. For over 25 years, he cared for the patients, managed the staff and administered the general running of the institution. Since joining Change Minds in May 2018, my world has consisted of Dr. Hills and the patients and the staff of the asylum. I have laughed with them, cried with them, and rejoiced at their successes. They are family and friends, even if a few, very few, are also pains in the bottom, as you can't expect everyone to be perfect. It was with surprise, but not a little personal satisfaction, that Laura proposed a project based upon my research, which turned into Dr. Hill's casebook. Dr. Hill's casebook uses the same principles behind Change Minds, but with the specific aim of producing a piece of community theatre about life at the asylum during Dr. Hill's leadership. Primary aim is to stimulate public conversation and compare past and present treatments of mental illness. Engagement and enthusiasm of the research participants and the theatre has been spectacular and has fulfilled my wildest dreams of bringing Dr. Hills to the knowledge of a wider public. Each researcher adds to the project their empathy for people over 100 years ago, the considered examination of the asylum records, and the special contribution that the participants bring from their own experiences of mental ill health. The beauty of Dr. Hill's casebook is that people, or indeed Change Minds, is that people who would not otherwise access primary sources, and I include myself in this, are engaging with archival records. Such heritage projects encourage a diversity of views and knowledge, which allows the community as a whole to access and discover its own history in ways which could not be achieved through more formal academic channels. It allows the telling of stories of people who are often ignored. It is projects like this that so clearly demonstrate that access to historical sources should never be restricted. The last 3 years have been an exhilarating mixture of search and discovery, and the revelation of stories long since hidden. It's been hard work at times, all those hours in the record office scribbling with a pencil, cursing quietly the handwriting of some of the medical officers, and transcribing the notes onto a computer, and then trying to produce a coherent piece for public consumption. But it's been immensely satisfying. I mean, who knew the history of lunacy could be so fascinating? And this is so demonstrably replicating what I've seen of workhouse records. There being, of course, a significant number of workhouse inmates, or those in receipt of out relief, who are also patients in the Norfolk Asylum. Jessica and Matt in Conversation 1 and Rachel with Stanley in Conversation 2 indicate that this event and associated organisations enable an opportunity for marginalised people to stand up and demonstrate their adaptability and creativity, and to also produce a platform for positivity. I would add that they also display the resilience of those often dismissed as misfits. That was Jessica and Matt's words, not mine. through those restoration trusts, I've been such an opportunity. I have a voice now. I have no medical experience. I would probably not be too good at counselling, but I can do historical research. From that research, I may possibly educate policymakers, prompt conversation about mental health, or perhaps help inspire someone in much the same way as I've been inspired and helped by the participants on Change Minds and Dr. Hill's Casebook. And to paraphrase Rachel, to have a chance to reveal Richard the person and not Richard the disability. An additional positive outcome from my research has been the contact with the outside world, especially over the past year, and albeit latterly via Zoom. I've met so many nice people who share an enthusiasm for the history and who seem to recognise the qualities I see in Dr. Hill's, if not quite with the same fanaticism. I have bizarrely now had to start keeping diaries and an address book. Last Thursday, I was privileged to be physically present at the first filming rehearsal of Dr. Hill's Casebook. I had previously attended 2 script read-through and rehearsal sessions via Zoom, but they could not really prepare me for the emotional eruption of seeing the project research translated into this dramatic performance. I'm not ashamed to say that I actually burst into tears at the end. So, I mean, alone agreeing with the writer and the theatre people, they've really done Dr. Hill's and the patients proud. I think we got a link somewhere to so you can book your tickets for the filming. But without doubt, Change Minds was and is the single most important factor in my road to recovery. It is no exaggeration to say it's not only life-changing, but life-saving. As part of the process of recovery, patients in the asylum were, when they were able, employed around the asylum, whether in the kitchen or laundry, on the garden farm, or as craftsmen, or at needlework. Patients were described as useful employed. I can look back on the last 3 years and say I have been useful. So, that's my spiel, thank you.
Richard, that was fantastic, and what an advocate you are for this. Therapeutic is a word we were talking about before with Laura and with Rachel last week, and that sense of therapy that comes out, I think, of research. And we talked a lot when we spoke earlier a couple of months ago, Richard, in what that has given to you and how important for our volunteers their research is in that well-being, whether it's their mental health, physical health, their sense of not feeling as isolated, particularly through COVID. We've had a lot of people picking up research, and I think it's very, very relevant. And I think as well, I'm going to say this, as a male, as a man, I think it's fantastic that you are so open about your emotions and your mental health and the journey you've been on. So thank you so much for that.
I have to say
generous,
that's taken several months of Zoom meetings and talks to get to this point. But
yes, I'm sure. Yes, me too. I think we're all in that boat. What I'm going to do now is, because last week I did do a bit of a verbal rundown of the mental health acts and the sort of that history. So I'm not going to repeat that because this will be recorded. And if anyone's got interest in that, do get in touch. It's a fascinating legal journey. The mental health and learning disability and the fusion of those two things, which is my interest, I suppose, of how that separates out. But what I'm going to do is just share on screen very quickly our Lunatics register from Southwell from 1855 to 1861, and looking at the labelling there and the words factious, which is a really interesting one, which I'm sure you know all about, Richard, these terms. can you give us a bit more of a clue of what fatuous might mean, because it doesn't come under learning
I have
disability?
never seen that in any case history in Norfolk.
Well, there you go. We learned something. Wow. Okay.
Not even in a case record. Certainly not as a description.
That's exciting. Okay. That's interesting, isn't it? How arbitrary. Yeah, well, it must be Southwell, yeah. How arbitrary some of these diagnoses are at this period of time, and I think that that's really interesting. And the other thing I wanted to point out, which will come into our debate later, is the price. So these people are obviously being supported by these parishes that are in and around Southwell and the Thurgarton 100, and this is the sort of cost. 12 shillings there. I don't know quite what they were getting, but there we go. And then when you drop down to the workhouse, there's the difference. So 3 and 6, so half the price just about, to keep people in the workhouse. So I think that's quite interesting, and I think the ages as well denote something about where people are staying. And I think because children aren't in this one, except there's a June, the children aren't in this one, but so that's interesting, the fatuous one, and that leads me really to my next share, which is this, and this is the Register of Lunatics. It's 1891. The justice order is for detention in the workhouse. So I wanted to show some documentation around how these things were dealt with in the workhouse. And this little boy of 11 is discharged to the asylum in 1909. The nature of the disease is idiocy. And I think they come to that decision because he can neither read nor write, although he's been at school for about 5 years. He's now 11 years of age, also presents the facial expressions of an idiot, whatever that is, and his mother also suffers from idiocy. Why he is sent to the asylum, and he goes on in the workhouse, in my opinion, a lunatic and a proper person to remain in the workhouse as a lunatic, and that the accommodation in the workhouse is sufficient for his proper care. So I don't know why this discharge appears on there. Other people, I'm sure, in our audience and in our group, and maybe you would be able to give us a bit of a clue there, whether he's come from the asylum or is going to the asylum. But it's an interesting document.
It certainly reads as though he was discharged to the asylum. So.
Yeah, that's what it says, isn't it? Yeah.
For no real reason.
No, for no real reason. And I think that I chose this because it's so arbitrary, and how unclear that distinction is as well between what we might say is a learning difficulty rather than a mental health problem. And then these are all around dementia. The middle one is around idiocy, and that he describes her as well nourished, has no marks or bruises about her body. She's got a spinal curvature and a small warty growth on the left side of her chest. And I thought, I'm not kind of sure what that has to do with her mental capacity or her mental health. It kind of reminded me of kind of a witch in the medieval times or something like that. So that there's a lot of, I think, eugenics that are wrapped up in both learning disability and mental health, and I talked a bit about eugenics last week. So I won't go over that again, but I think this idea of labelling and categorisation in both the historical setting, and I wanted to open that up really to us three to talk about labelling for you, Richard, within your mental health journey. How's that felt from someone who clearly, you know, has worked through it?
Well, when they decide to give me a definition, I mean, it's a label they choose to use. I'm more dealing with the symptoms rather than whatever diagnosis they decide to come up with. I mean, if you could choose between depression or melancholia, I prefer melancholia. It sounds much more impressive. Yeah, but,
yes, it's got a romantic sort of feel to it, hasn't it? Melancholia. It's yeah.
Bit more artistic, but it's I think there's too much nowadays to actually try and get you down into some sort of diagnosis. So there's sort of so many definitions now that it's sort of you lose track of the symptoms, which I think certainly in the Norfolk Asylum, and everyone should take what I say about asylums in reference to the Norfolk Asylum under Dr. Hills. So it's I'd rather sort of generalise. It's all you get this sort of feeling that the definition is just something that they need to send off to the commissioners in lunacy for their statistics. Meanwhile, we will deal with the symptoms. Call it what they like, whether it's mania or melancholia or whatever. These are the symptoms, and we're going to treat those, which seems a more logical way of going about things. So you can't really judge what they come in with, because it would depend mainly on either the medical officer on the outside or what a relative has said, and then you find out that the patient doesn't have those symptoms anymore. These are different symptoms which are the ones that need to be treated. So
do you think Dr. Hills was forward thinking then in his diagnoses sort of matrix, or the way that he those labellings led, as you're saying, to a particular kind of treatment, perhaps? Do you think now, where you get a treatment and you get drugs, or you get therapeutic, perhaps intervention or whatever now, that we are still, from Dr. Hills, obviously, because you're, as you say, that's your focus, would you say we've improved or not improved, or do you think there's still a direct sort of relationship?
I think there was definitely, certainly with Dr. Hills, the more direct observation of what the patient was going through. Nowadays, you sort of, right, oh, he's depressed, right, stamp, right, we'll deal like that. And meanwhile, we won't bother listening to what he's saying or what she's saying or how she's acting, how he's acting. And listen. I mean, there's a number of times I've been saying things, and they just carry on with what the diagnosis has been made, and they will go along with that, as opposed to ongoing observation of what the patient's going through. It's just in my experience.
So I suppose there's yes, Laura.
I was just going to say that I think the labels, I'm really struck by the difference in the cost of somebody being in the asylum, somebody being in the workhouse. And actually that, for me, that really connects with now, because if you have a diagnosis, then one of the benefits of that is that you're more likely to get a disability benefit if your diagnosis meets that threshold. You know, mental illnesses are so hidden, it's really difficult to persuade the DWP and their assessors that that you've got a serious illness which might prevent you from doing all sorts of things and that you need support. So I think quite often people find that a diagnosis does really serve that purpose, because it puts you on that side of the fence rather than on the much more sort of risky side of the fence, where your mental illness is the social factor, because you're poor or badly nourished or at risk or actually homeless. So I think that's a really significant connection, and labels really do matter, don't they? I know that for some people to have a diagnosis is such a relief, because it means that you fit with a community of other people who it sort of feels like you know where you are. It's a very personal thing, I think.
It is a very personal. I worked in a homeless with YMCA for a number of years, and having worked in mental health before that, and actually people who are homeless, once they got that label, they were so relieved that they felt that while they were in a state where they didn't know, so particularly things like personality disorder, that has become, is a more recent diagnosis, that is that sort of anxiety level, lots of different kind of antisocial behaviours recognised and diagnosed in one kind of category, or a number of categories. I'm not totally sure of all the categories, but it certainly really made people very relieved that they had that diagnosis, and they could then, as you say, access funding, but also access therapies as well, I think, and different resources.
Well,
yes,
I mean,
Richard.
to some extent that's a false diagnosis. You're just trying to find something so they can access help, whereas they're ill, they need help.
Yes.
What you're faffing around for a definition. I mean, I've preliminarily been assessed as on the Asperger's, autism, what it's called now, spectrum. So I'm waiting 3 years to actually get a proper diagnosis appointment.
It's a nightmare.
I mean, how relevant that is now at this stage in my life, I don't know. It's quite obviously important for earlier on. There was a comment about I'm assuming it's how people are assessed. The procedure was a medical officer would certify someone as insane because, and then they'd have to do a medical statement. Which was why they were then sent to the asylum. So I suppose there would be a tendency to think, oh my God, I've got to think of something to put down on this form. That's that's nice and general. So obviously people, once you're in the asylum, then you can be properly treated for the illness you've got or the symptoms you're showing. So it's people hunting around for what shall we call him or her. So it's a very uncertain procedure. I see from the Victorian side of it, and as for now, you've got dozens and dozens of different symptoms, different syndromes or whatever. So it was easy when you just had 12 categories.
Yes, I suppose labeling is also, in that historic sense, we always caveat what we do in terms of our exhibitions to explain to people that this is a 19th century, early 20th century terms for what we now call mental health, the learning disability, as the catch-all, but these are specific symptoms which we would call depression now, or we would have lots of different kinds of analysis around what that is, or diagnoses around that, and we have to explain to people that these have now become derogatory terms. So I think history tells us something interesting, and I was saying last week, I'm hoping, less than 50 years, we turn around and say, learning disability, what was that about? What was that? These people are just different. So there's That's, I think the labelling, yes, as you say, Laura, leads you to resources because it defines you. But as you're saying, Richard, that is becoming such a wide thing. And the stigmatisation, does the labelling have a relationship to the stigma that you experience? What about you, Laura? What do you see in people that come to Change Minds?
Well, I must say, people do, because there's quite a lot of encouragement for people to talk about their mental health, like Richard's doing now, and a feeling that that's a way to reduce stigma. And, you know, there's a kind of almost like a sort of a kind of, I think some people have said to me, it's like a bandwagon, you know, to jump on the mental health bandwagon. But I still advise people to be very wary of talking about their mental health, except in an environment where they think they're going to get an empathetic hearing, because, you know, we've got someone in one of our projects, he went for a job, he was perfectly well equipped to do that job, he followed the guidance, he told them that he had bipolar and that this was, you know, that was part of his life, and I'm afraid that he didn't get the job, and he only didn't get it after the interview, after they'd said, you know, shake his hand and say goodbye to him at the door. So he was expecting to get it. And I think you've really got to be careful. It's stigma is, it doesn't disappear just because people say they don't believe in it anymore. You know, it's like racism. It's there. It's there. You just, it just may not be manifest. So I think you do have to, people who talk about that really do have to think about what the consequences are, of which someone like Richard obviously has thought about very carefully about what he wants to say and is here being open with us. But I do think there's, people need to be aware of the risks around that. And so we're addressing stigma. But yeah, it's like everything to do with mental health. It's all a grey area.
Yes.
I don't know, don't you think, Richard? It's a grey area.
Well, it's only been a long journey for me to actually be able to come on to to start talking about what's happened to me. I mean, I remember talking through some participants at Change Minds, and we were saying, oh, I've never mentioned my mental illness to anyone. So here I am spouting off. I think it's because I've got the confidence that the research that I've done, I mean, yes, I'm a lunatic, yes, but this is what I've done. This is what I've been able to do this despite that. So it's a confidence that having done something, I've completed something, I've been useful, and so I can be more open about it. I mean, 3 years ago, I wouldn't just dare to tell anyone about it. I was reluctant to engage even with the DWP, because that would mean I'd have to go through all the rubbish and try to justify stuff. So so it did affect everything. But and now Laura's raised the point of going for a job interview and said, oh dear, I'm not going to mention it. There's me feeling confident. No, it's because of this background for the research and my experience with Change Minds and Dr. Hill's casebook.
Yes, I think it's true, and I think that it's okay for people to propose, you know, be brave, be strong, talk about, let's talk about it. But if you're not the one actually experiencing that stigma or that consequences of that, it has to be an individual decision. And within this context, within the support of the therapy that you know, the therapeutic experience you've had through Change Minds, and this gives us, that's what I'm really interested in, particularly the workhouse. So the workhouse had a stigma within communities. Some women would not go into hospitals, NHS hospitals, post 1948, to have their children because they were going into a workhouse. They weren't, they were going into a hospital, but So that just the very system and the building carried this sense that if you went in there, you wouldn't come out again.
Yes.
And Asylum carries that, you know, similar thing. Goffman, we talk about, you know, various philosophers as well that have talked about the effect of institutionalization and what it means, and how it, that deprivation of liberty has on a person, on a human being, even if it looks and feels like a community. As I did say, I worked in a big psychiatric hospital that was a former asylum in Moorhaven in Devon, so right on the moors, classic 19th century novel going on there. And we were very isolated, staff, patients, we were a community. With all the things of the difficulties that communities had. And when that got taken away and was replaced by a very insubstantial and unsustainable system 30 years ago that we're still living with, and there are very few protections, and people are so vulnerable, really. And I can see that sense of the security, and it's that balance, isn't it? So we do still lock away our people with learning disability and autism. We still institutionalize them because we aren't quite strong enough as a society yet to take that amount of difference.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please do.
I was just going to say that we had a really interesting visit to Change Minds once by the person who was then the medical director of our mental health trust, and he'd never seen these records before, and he was really fascinated by them because Dr. Hills, he was Dr. Hills, really. He was the modern equivalent of Dr. Hills. And he said,
only one Dr. Hills.
Only one.
But he said what I thought was a really shocking thing. He said that his view of when he looked at the records, he said we've gone from confinement to abandonment.
That's very good. Yeah, absolutely. And the world out there for people who are vulnerable in any way is so cruel and so difficult to navigate. Even at just that level, it's just so confusing and difficult to navigate. And I think COVID has really, we were open in August, and people did come at that point in time because they've been segregated, for want of a better word, through the summer. And they came with a very different kind of set of empathetic tools, actually, to understand our site. Now, I'm not someone who's very absolutely optimistic, to introduce that theme, about COVID and how it's changed. I think it's revealed a lot. I think it will be very quickly unrevealed again and shut away again, and let's just go on our holidays. And so how do you both feel about this sort of idea that we're all going to be more empathetic and more optimistic, or, you know, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Go on, Laura. Oh, Richard.
You say Richard.
Yeah, go Richard.
Pessimistic. It'll soon go back to normal, and everyone will just. I mean, certainly from the Norfolk and Suffolk Mental Health Trust. I mean, it was overburdened before. I mean, it's now going to get extra input, and they just dump people that they can't help and concentrate on those they can get back, which is much like a DWP policy when I was working there. Just get the people who can work out so we can get the good targets. They get them cured and out, and that's it. And we won't bother about the ones that are long term, unfortunately. Yeah. And I can't see the recent elections have improved my pessimism.
Yeah, That was quite revealing, wasn't it, actually? Yeah. So Laura, how are you,
Yeah, well,
talk to us about optimism.
Yes, I mean, I think we talked before, Jan, because I was saying that that if we go back to Dr. Hill's, that that he was right at the end of this period of therapeutic optimism, the sort of very last bit of it, I think. And for me, there's a thread that runs from the Norfolk Lunatic Asylum and this sort of therapeutic good practice, I think. And then the Northfield experiments in the Second World War, about trying to see how groups could manage themselves and how you could create a kind of benign, sort of almost what we might use as patient-led or co-produced environment. And so from the Northfield experiment, I think that then you go through the therapeutic communities that were established in the 50s and 60s. And then, well, I'm especially interested in David Clarke at Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridge, where he was the superintendent in 1953, started, and then sort of transformed the hospital itself into a kind of enormous therapeutic community. And then, just as you've said, Jan, then the kind of collapse through care in the community, insufficiently resourced. And then I think there has been this sort of, and then the day hospitals. And actually one of our expert advisors, and we have this expert advisory board that Richard's a member of, said that what we do is like the day hospitals of the future. And I do think that we've picked up, I hope, that thread of therapeutic optimism, where small organisations like ours can be a space, not necessarily a physical space, but a space for thought, a space for relationship, for interesting things to do, a space for respect, that you can have those spaces, and a space for sort of straightforward help, like I'll help you
signposting or
exactly.
form filling, and it's interesting that museums are at the forefront now of a massive cultural volte-face in a way, with racism, with looking at dark and difficult histories, encompassing our identity as a nation in all of its facets. And it's a very exciting time to be working in museums, I think, because a lot of museums are placing themselves in as hubs, really, for different work, and whether working with the elderly, learning disability, mental health, which actually for me, mental health covers everything. You can almost see what someone's going through because how they express their mental health or not. And so because people with learning disability have mental health, they may come across as very trying to please and be jolly, but actually they do suffer a lot from poverty and mental health. So all these things cross, and intersection is the word, isn't it? Intersect. And I think for us, I know all our partners at the network are all exploring how we talk about contemporary experiences within using our historical record, and what that historical record has to tell us, but also offering projects that actually do affect people's lives. And I suppose a couple of projects we've worked on, and one in particular was Do It Different, where we work with people with learning disability, and a gay learning disabled artist emerged out of that. He was already an artist, but he had the space to do so much more and to talk about safely his LGBTQ life as a learning disabled person. And That is so informative and so brilliant as a space, as you say, Laura, to explore what can museum spaces, what can the Workhouse Network offer spaces, and how much research and historical research can be a therapeutic tool. And so, Richard, you've talked about the therapy, we're talking about the future for you in an optimistic way now around your research. Where's it go next? This fantastic play is going to happen, which everyone here has got to click on and pass it on. But what's next?
Yeah, I should qualify my previous answer. When I said pessimism, that was obviously in relation to the professional help. Frankly, I've abandoned that after my experience. So all my eggs are in the Restoration Trust basket.
Wow, Laura!
Thanks for that.
Don't drop that basket.
I mean, and with the Workhouse Network, I mean, I did some research on More Than Oliver Twist, and it's just really such a logical adjunct to what I was doing on the Asylum. So hopefully, when Dr. Hills is now coming to a close, I can just jump on the Workhouse Network and all the two.
That'd be fantastic.
I mean, they are just so much the same. It's logical, and I've enjoyed the Asylum work, and I've enjoyed what I've done so far in Workhouse research. And of course, I've still got the book on Dr. Hills to write.
Got that book to finish.
Dr. Hills, The Life and Times of Dr. Hills. On that, in that's, yeah, I mean, I'm very optimistic. I mean, I'm still engaging with the Restoration Trust, and I start a new course, a new project on this next week, Sound Minds, which is about the sound archives at the Norfolk Record Office, which is good.
Great title. Title. Yeah.
Anything else that come up with Restoration Trust, I'll join in. But on that side of it, I am quite optimistic. The sound foundation I've had in the Asylum research is good solid base, so I can go on from that. So,
yeah. I think that's important, isn't it, Laura? Those kind of follow-on projects. How do we sustain rather than a one-off? And in museums, I'm really aware of this. I'm sure other workers in museums are, that we don't use people for their issue and then that's it. You know, this is a lot. You have to be in it for the long-term relationship.
Definitely. Yeah, I was looking at I saw that one of the questions, somebody said in the chat that I think Helen Bainbridge has said, actually it's a question for Richard, so I hope you don't mind, Richard, I'm going to assume your question. It says, so Helen said, do you think the difference was because people were living in the asylum permanently rather than living at home and being seen now and again? And I suppose that takes me to this thing that Jan's referred to as well about space, that over the long haul, that's where you get these relationships and safety and connection again. And I really agree. I think that if museums can be spaces where people can feel secure that they're welcome and that welcome isn't going to disappear, then I think museums' social function can really be ramped up, because we've really lost a lot of physical spaces that people can be in together, or that can be held by a digital frame. So I think museums can serve this, well, great museums like like Jan's are doing this, and like Gressel, you know, they're doing this stuff already, and so yeah, more of that. And also I passionately believe that an investigation of the past that's really well done and with really good quality research is is really, really expansive of people's inner worlds.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, that's also important. It's a two-way street. The museums should have got the resources, but it is useful for the museums themselves to have these people who don't normally engage with them coming in and making suggestions or commenting, or it increases what the museum's trying to do, I would have thought. So it's a two-way street, so both sides are benefiting, which is nice.
Yeah, agree. Hi, Emily.
Hello.
Question time.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. It's been really fascinating, really, to hear both of your experiences and about more about Dr. Hill as well. It's been brilliant. So thank you very much for coming to talk to us and being so open. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I'll get to those straight away before we run out of time. So the first one is, why did it cost more to keep lunatics than those not labelled as so in workhouses? I think this might be referring to when you showed the list, Jan, of the lunatic ward. I think it might be talking about that.
Yes, I think it is. Richard, have you got any ideas why that might be different?
There's Norfolk again. It's clearly because there's more care for the actual lunatics in the asylum, especially in Norfolk. I mean, can I plug my aid memoir? If it's on the Restoration Trust website, that does go into what sort of things were provided in Norfolk Asylum. Entertainments. They had better diet especially. They even went on excursions to the seaside and stuff. So it's the whole different kettle of fish in the asylum. They were providing proper medical care as opposed to workhouse. They just trying to save money. But they had the same financial pressures in the asylum. But I think with the medical superintendent, he had a bit more day-to-day power.
Yeah, yes, that's kind of answered the second question, which was how different do you think it would be for a patient in an asylum compared to a ward in a workhouse?
Much better.
Yeah, you've answered that really well already. Go on, Richard. Sorry.
Yeah, that's difficult to give an answer. Both institutions would have been inspected by the commissioners in lunacy. You do see reports in the workhouse records about annual inspections. Again, I should imagine it would depend on the master or the medical superintendent, but certainly there's more money spent on asylum patients.
So like most things, it would be luck really on where you were put and who.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
That's it for the questions we have on here. There's been a couple of links in the chat, so everyone please have a look at those. Patrick, one of our attendees, has said there's an interesting discussion of fatuous here, and has put a link into a blog, so please do have a look at that. I did have a look up.
Thank you, Richard.
What fatuous meant, and it was definition of fatuous is complacently or inanely foolish. So that's the definition. And there's
I don't understand where that's come from. I have never seen it in a Norfolk case record.
It's an interesting term. I did wonder if you'd know, you see. I thought I'd get a quick cheap shot in and and go away with some information. But that's really interesting. Thank you. The other Richard on the
it was Patrick. Sorry,
Patrick. Sorry. Yeah. Well, I think this has been a fascinating and interesting discussion, and I hope that we can continue these connections that we're making through these conversations. Each week there's been these connections that have come up, and keeping that alive and making sure that we can keep Richard and all that resource with us in the network as well would be just fantastic. To welcome you in, Richard, to Pacific projects as well. It's not just your research, it's your knowledge around those kinds of projects as well would be really invaluable to us going forward.
Well, it's a two-way street, and as I said, both benefits, so it's nice.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay.
So,
Are we?
so much.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome, Laura. Thank you for coming. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.